A rampaging buffalo, an ancient secret, and a young girl in a wheelchair searching for the truth. When past and present collide, everyone's fate will be irreversibly changed. The morning sun penetrated lazily through the blinds of the small apartment in downtown Oak Ridge. Emily Carter adjusted her glasses while finalizing her article about the expansion of agribusiness in the rural Midwest. Her fingers glided skillfully across the keyboard, transforming information into narratives that few could create with such precision. At 28, the freelance journalist had grown accustomed to this routine: wake up, write, observe the world through her window, and occasionally venture out on the few streets her apartment allowed her to access with ease. The wheelchair was parked near her desk, a silent companion to a life that had adapted to physical limitations without losing its intensity. Emily had deep brown eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances, an essential characteristic for a journalist who needed to capture nuances even from a distance. "So, did you finish the article about the sugarcane festival?" Maria's voice broke the silence of the apartment. Her longtime friend had arrived without fanfare as usual, carrying a bag of bread and a smile that brightened the room. "Almost there. Just adding the final touches," replied Emily, saving the file before turning her chair toward her friend. "But I confess I'm tired of writing about the same events, the same people, the same stories." Maria set the bag on the table and approached the window, opening the blinds completely. "You need a change of scenery, Em. Being cooped up in this apartment isn't going to bring stories to you." Emily sighed, pushing her chair to the window. From there, she could see the city's movement, people hurrying by, oblivious to the sense of stagnation she felt. "You know it's not that simple for me." "Since when have you ever chosen the simplest path for anything?" Maria retorted, displaying a mischievous smile. "As it happens, I have a proposal that might interest this journalist who's hungry for different stories." Emily raised an eyebrow, curious. She knew that tone of voice well and knew Maria was plotting something. "Remember Thomas Anderson? That agribusiness entrepreneur you always mention in your articles?" "Of course I remember. The man is practically a legend around here. Owner of Hope Ranch, pioneer in elite cattle breeding techniques." "What about him?" Maria pulled out an invitation printed on refined paper from her pocket. "As it happens, his ranch is opening its doors to a select group of journalists. It's a kind of tour to showcase the genetic innovations in his livestock. And guess who got an invitation for—" Emily took the paper with skepticism. "How did you get this? They say he's extremely private." "I have my contacts," Maria winked. "Besides, your work has been gaining recognition. They know who Emily Carter is." The journalist examined the invitation with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Hope Ranch had always held a particular fascination for her. There was something about Thomas Anderson's trajectory that deeply intrigued her, especially the early years of his administration, shrouded in mysteries and rumors. "I don't know, Maria. A ranch that size, with uneven terrain, it wouldn't exactly be accessible for me." "Don't worry about that. I specifically mentioned your needs, and they assured me that everything would be adapted. It's a unique chance, Em. The opportunity to finally see up close this world that fascinates you so much." Emily remained silent, contemplating the city horizon while considering the proposal. Her journalistic mind was already formulating questions, imagining angles for a report that could be her big professional breakthrough. "When would this visit be?" she finally asked, unable to hide her growing interest. "Next week," Maria answered, satisfied with her friend's reaction. "Enough time for you to prepare your most incisive questions." Emily smiled, feeling a frisson of adrenaline she hadn't experienced in a long time. "All right, I'll accept the invitation." What she didn't know was that this seemingly simple decision was about to unearth secrets that had remained hidden for years. Hope Ranch held stories that extended beyond its imposing fences, and Emily was about to become part of a much larger puzzle than she could imagine. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Tell us what city you're watching from. Will continue. The road that wound through the rural area of Oak Ridge seemed endless. Emily observed through the window of the adapted car how the landscape gradually transformed, urban constructions giving way to vast green fields and fences that seemed to extend to the horizon. The driver, specially hired to take her to Hope. Ranch remained silent, breaking his muteness only to confirm if she was comfortable. "We're almost there," he announced after a particularly sharp curve. "It's just after that hill." Emily adjusted herself in her seat, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She had extensively researched Thomas Anderson in recent weeks, gathering every fragment of available information about the businessman and his property. She knew he had transformed a medium-sized ranch into an agribusiness empire in record time, something that had always raised suspicions in her investigative mind. When the car finally crossed the imposing gates of Hope Ranch, Emily couldn't contain an exclamation of surprise. The magnitude of the place exceeded any expectation. An avenue of century-old trees led to an impressive headquarters, a mixture of colonial and modern architecture harmoniously integrated into the natural landscape. Parked in front of the main house, the car was received by a middle-aged man, dressed with unpretentious elegance that characterized major ranchers: linen shirt, well-cut pants, and impeccably polished boots. "Miss Carter, welcome to Hope Ranch. I'm Thomas Anderson," he introduced himself as he opened the car door, extending his hand in a warm greeting. His eyes, an intense blue, contrasted with his sun-tanned skin. "It's a pleasure to meet you in person, Mr. Anderson," replied Emily, accepting his firm handshake. Thomas gestured to one of the employees, who immediately brought the wheelchair, strategically positioning it to facilitate the transfer. With skill acquired through years of practice, Emily settled into the chair, grateful to notice that the path to the main house was paved and flat. "I hope the trip wasn't too tiring," commented Thomas, as they walked toward the house's porch. "I've prepared a complete tour of the facilities, but we can start with coffee to replenish our energy." The spacious porch offered a panoramic view of the ranch's fields and facilities. Emily could glimpse in the distance modern sheds and confinement areas that contrasted with the bucolic landscape. Employees moved about in tractors and utility vehicles, evidencing the intense activity of the property. "Your ranch is really impressive," commented Emily, as she accepted a cup of coffee served by an employee. "It's hard to believe that just 10 years ago this place was just another ordinary rural property." An enigmatic smile crossed Thomas's lips. "Success requires vision, Miss Carter, and sometimes the courage to explore paths that others fear." There was something in the businessman's tone that aroused Emily's curiosity, an almost imperceptible note of caution, as if he measured each word. "And what paths were those, Mr. Anderson? I've read a lot about your genetic innovations in the herd, but the details always seem shrouded in mystery." Thomas took a sip of coffee before answering, his eyes studying Emily with renewed interest. "Science advances faster than bureaucracy, Miss Carter. Sometimes one must take a few steps ahead, and then wait for the rest of the world to catch up." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a stocky man with a rugged appearance, who approached with determined steps. "Excuse me, boss. The visitors from the university have already arrived and are waiting in the laboratory," he announced, casting a curious look at Emily. "Thank you, Mike. Tell them I'll be there momentarily." Turning to Emily, Thomas smiled. "This is Mike, my foreman and trusted man. He's been with me since the beginning, when all this was nothing but an ambitious dream." Mike slightly inclined his head in greeting. There was something in his gaze that made Emily uncomfortable, a mixture of distrust and recognition, as if he already knew her from somewhere. "If you'll allow me, Miss Carter," continued Thomas, "I'd like to start our tour with the heart of the ranch, the genetic improvement center. That's where we conduct our most important work." As they followed a side path, Emily noticed an unusual movement in one of the distant stables. A group of employees seemed agitated around a pen, and she could hear the distinct sound of a large animal. "What's in that stable?" she asked, pointing to the building. Thomas's expression changed for a fraction of a second, something so subtle that it would have gone unnoticed by someone less observant than Emily. "Ah, that's a special sector. That's where we keep our most valuable specimen, Thor, a buffalo with unique genetic characteristics. We can visit him later if you're interested." The mention of the animal awakened a strange sensation in Emily, something close to déjà vu that she couldn't explain. Before she could elaborate more questions, Thomas quickened his pace, leading her toward a modern building that contrasted with the traditional architecture of the ranch. "Here is our research laboratory," he announced with evident pride. "The Phai-Tu, place where the future of American agribusiness is being shaped." Emily observed the imposing structure, feeling that there, among sophisticated equipment and advanced research, could be the answers to questions she didn't even know she had. The research laboratory at Hope Ranch was a world apart. Emily watched fascinated as various researchers in white coats moved between sophisticated equipment and computer screens, displaying complex genetic sequences. Thomas walked ahead of her, greeting employees with familiarity while proudly explaining each step of the process. "Here we develop artificial insemination techniques that have revolutionized national livestock farming," he explained, indicating a room where technicians manipulated samples under controlled conditions. "We've managed to increase the herd's birth rate by 45% and significantly improve the genetic characteristics of the cattle." Emily took mental notes, impressed with the magnitude of the operation, but her mind kept returning to that distant stable and the buffalo mentioned by Thomas. There was something about that story that intrigued her, a piece that didn't seem to fit in the puzzle. "Mr. Anderson," she interrupted when he paused, "I'm curious about the buffalo you mentioned. Thor, correct? Why keep a buffalo isolated on a ranch specialized in beef cattle?" A momentary silence settled. Thomas exchanged glances with one of the researchers before answering, his cordial smile quickly returning. "Thor is not a common buffalo, Miss Carter. He represents the pinnacle of our genetic diversification project. We could say he's our most successful experiment." He consulted his wristwatch. "Actually, we're a bit ahead of schedule. If you prefer, we can visit him right now." Emily nodded, trying to disguise her growing interest. The way Thomas talked about Thor suggested there was much more to that story than a simple pet or laboratory guinea pig. The path to the stable was more uneven, forcing Thomas to push Emily's wheelchair through some stretches. As they approached, she could feel a different atmosphere, denser, almost palpable. The employees who crossed their path seemed to cast curious glances, some even apprehensive. "Thor is temperamental," explained Thomas, as they approached the isolated stable. "Only a few employees are permitted to deal directly with him. His strength is extraordinary, even by the standards of the species." "And how long has he been here on the ranch?" asked Emily. "Since the beginning," replied Thomas, a note of nostalgia in his voice. "Thor was here when I acquired the property. He is in a way the symbol of everything we've built." That information caught Emily by surprise. If Thor had been there since before Thomas's arrival, what would be his origin? And why would a rancher focused on innovation keep an animal that seemed so out of context in the production? The stable was different from the other sheds, more robust with visible security systems and a structure that seemed designed to contain something much more dangerous than a simple buffalo. An employee, with a serious appearance, approached as he saw them. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson. Thor is a bit agitated today. It might not be the best time for visits," he warned, casting a hesitant look at Emily. "Don't worry, Ryan. Miss Carter is a journalist and is doing a report on our facilities. A quick visit won't hurt." Ryan nodded, though visibly uncomfortable, and opened the door to the stable. The interior was surprisingly spacious, with a climate control system that kept the temperature pleasant. In the center, separated by reinforced fencing, was Thor. Emily felt her breath falter for an instant. The buffalo was an imposing sight, larger than any specimen she had ever seen, with lustrous black fur and impressive horns that curved in a perfect form. But it wasn't these characteristics that impacted her. It was the animal's eyes, deep, intelligent, almost human. Thor, who until then had been calmly ruminating, raised his head the moment Emily entered. His nostrils dilated, as if catching a specific aroma in the air. And then, to everyone's amazement, the animal approached the fence, fixing its gaze directly on Emily. "Extraordinary," murmured Thomas, observing the scene with scientific interest. "He rarely shows curiosity about strangers." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. There was something familiar in that gaze, an inexplicable connection that made her heart race. Unable to contain herself, She moved her chair closer to the fence, ignoring Ryan's warning. "Miss, please keep your distance. Thor can be unpredictable." But Emily barely heard. It was as if there were only her and the buffalo in that space, a silent communication incomprehensible to the others present. Thor slightly tilted his head, an almost human gesture of recognition. "Do you know each other?" Thomas's question, although made in a joking tone, carried an underlying tension that didn't go unnoticed by Emily. "No, of course not," she replied, forcing herself to look away from the animal. "It's just that there's something fascinating about him." At that moment, one of the handlers hurriedly entered the stable, distracting Ryan. In an instant of carelessness, the chain holding Thor loosened, and the buffalo, as if waiting for exactly that moment, advanced with surprising agility. Chaos immediately ensued. Warning shouts echoed through the stable as Thomas pulled Emily's chair back, placing himself between her and the animal. Thor, however, showed no typical aggression. His movements were precise, almost calculated, as if he had a specific purpose. "Get her out of here!" shouted Ryan, running to get a containment rod. As she was hastily removed from the stable, Emily kept her eyes fixed on Thor. What she saw there wasn't an animal in fury, but something that left her deeply disturbed. A conscious intelligence, a deliberate purpose, and even more disconcerting, an inexplicable sensation of mutual recognition. "Are you sure you're okay? We can end the tour for today if you prefer." Thomas's voice sounded genuinely concerned as he offered a glass of water to Emily, now on the main house's porch. "I'm fine, just a bit shaken," she replied, trying to organize her thoughts. The incident with Thor had left something beyond shock, a deep uneasiness, as if that encounter had awakened some dormant memory that she couldn't fully access. "I apologize for what happened. Thor had never behaved that way before." Thomas sat in a nearby chair, studying the journalist's expression. Usually he's docile, almost contemplative. This reaction was unusual. Emily took a sip of water, buying time to formulate her next question. "You mentioned that Thor was here when you acquired the ranch. Who did this property belong to previously?" An imperceptible shadow crossed Thomas's countenance. "The ranch belonged to a researcher named Robert Carter, a brilliant man, but one who didn't have the business acumen to turn his ideas into a viable enterprise." He paused, as if carefully choosing his next words. "Unfortunately, he suffered an accident in his laboratory. The family wasn't interested in keeping the property, and I ended up acquiring it at a judicial auction." The name hit Emily like lightning. Robert Carter, her father. She tried to maintain her composure, silently thanking that she was seated, as her legs, even without feeling, seemed unable to support her at that moment. How had she not made the connection before? Hope Ranch was her family's former property, the place where she'd spent the first years of her childhood, before the tragic accident that took her father and left her in a wheelchair. "Miss Carter, are you feeling ill?" Thomas's voice sounded distant, as if coming from somewhere else. "No, I'm fine. I just need to process all the information from the day." She forced a smile, knowing she needed to hide her discovery. "You said Thor had been here since the former owner's time. Does that mean the buffalo was one of Mr. Carter's research projects?" Thomas hesitated for a moment. "Yes, in a way. Robert had interesting theories about genetic improvement. Thor was part of an experiment that was never fully documented. When I acquired the ranch, I decided to continue the studies, albeit by different paths." Emily nodded, trying not to show the whirlwind of emotions consuming her. Fragmented memories began to emerge, flashes of a childhood in the countryside, her father's smiling face showing her the animals, a forbidden laboratory where important things happened. "And what did you discover about Mr. Carter's experiments?" she insisted, taking advantage of her position as a journalist to ask questions that, as a daughter, she'd never had the opportunity to ask. "Just enough to continue my own research," replied Thomas, suddenly rising. "It's getting late. I suggest we continue the tour tomorrow after breakfast. I've prepared a room for you to stay comfortably overnight." The abrupt change of subject didn't go unnoticed by Emily, but she decided not to insist. She needed time to digest that revelation, and mainly to investigate on her own. After dinner, served in the elegant dining room of the main house, Emily was led to a room adapted to her needs. Thomas had thought of everything: support bars. In the bathroom, bed at the ideal height, adequate space to maneuver the chair. The impeccable hospitality, however, didn't diminish the growing suspicion that there was much more to the story of Hope Ranch than her host was willing to reveal. When she finally found herself alone, Emily took her tablet and began to frantically search. Robert Carter, her father, had been a respected geneticist with several published articles on genetic improvement in cattle. Official records indicated that he had died in a laboratory accident when Emily was only 7 years old. The same accident that had left her paraplegic, although she preserved only confused memories of that day. Her mother, devastated by the incident, never wanted to talk about it, moving with her daughter to the city and cutting all ties with the rural past. Emily had grown up knowing only the basics about her father: that he was a dedicated scientist, that he loved her deeply, and that he worked on something important that would change the future of American livestock. One detail caught her attention as she scoured the online records: the date of the ranch's acquisition by Thomas Anderson, just 3 months after her father's death, insufficient time for a regular judicial auction. How had Thomas managed to acquire the property so quickly? And why had her mother never mentioned that the ranch had been sold? Even more intriguing was the mention of her father's experiments. What exactly was Robert Carter researching? And what was the connection with Thor, the buffalo that seemed to recognize her somehow? Emily closed her eyes, trying to access memories buried by time and trauma. Fragmented images emerged: an underground laboratory, her father's concentrated face, the constant presence of a large animal, and a phrase repeated like a mantra by her father: "Consciousness transcends form, my little one. Always remember that." A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Mike, the foreman, bringing a cup of warm milk. "The boss asked me to ensure you were comfortable," he said, placing the tray on the nightstand. His eyes studied Emily with uncomfortable intensity. "I am, thank you," she replied, noticing that the man seemed to want to say something more. "Is there a problem, Mr. Mike?" He hesitated, looking quickly at the empty corridor before approaching. "You look a lot like him, you know. You have the same eyes." "Excuse me?" "Like your father." "Robert Carter," whispered Mike. "I worked here back then, and I remember you, little Em. You used to run through these corridors." Emily felt her heart accelerate. Mike's confirmation concretized what she already suspected. It wasn't a coincidence to be there, at that ranch, face to face with her past. "You knew my father?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Mike nodded, closing the door behind him and approaching cautiously. "I worked for Dr. Robert for almost 10 years. He was more than a boss to me. He was a friend. What happened to him?" The man interrupted himself, his eyes watery. "It wasn't a simple accident." Emily indicated a nearby chair. "Please sit down. I need to know what happened. I grew up without answers, without understanding what took my father from me and put me in this chair." Mike sat down, nervously looking at the door once more. "I shouldn't be here. If Mr. Anderson discovers I'm talking to you—" "Please," insisted Emily, "I need to understand, what was my father researching? And what's the relationship with Thor?" The foreman's wrinkled face contorted in an expression of internal conflict. "Your father was a visionary, miss. He believed he could create a bridge between humans and animals, not just genetically improve cattle, but establish a deeper connection." Mike paused as if assessing whether he should continue. Thor was his most ambitious project. "How so? What was special about him?" "Dr. Robert developed a technique to transfer neural patterns. The idea was that Thor wouldn't just be an exceptional buffalo in physical terms, but would also possess elevated cognitive capabilities. He wanted to prove that consciousness could be modulated, expanded." Emily remembered her father's words. Consciousness transcends form. It was beginning to make sense. Thor was the first to demonstrate signs of advanced intelligence, continued Mike. He began to solve complex problems, to demonstrate a level of understanding that went far beyond animal instinct. It was as if there was something more in him. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. And my father? What happened on the day of the accident? Mike's gaze became distant, as if reliving a painful memory. It was on a Sunday. You had come to visit your father in the laboratory, as you frequently did. Dr. Robert was about to perform a final test on Thor, something related to complete neural transfer. He never explained exactly what he intended to do. Emily closed her eyes, fragments of memory emerging like bubbles in a dark lake. She remembered the underground laboratory, the smell of chemicals, her father's enthusiasm. There was an explosion, continued Mike. The laboratory's energy system collapsed. When we managed to get in, we found you unconscious near the door. Your father was. The foreman's voice failed. He was fallen near Thor's chamber. There was nothing we could do. And Thomas, how does he enter this story? Asked Emily, fighting against the tears that threatened to fall. Anderson was an investor in the project, revealed Mike, lowering his voice even more. He believed in the commercial potential of the research, but had different ideas about its application. He wanted to use the technology to create lineages of superintelligent animals capable of drastically increasing agribusiness productivity. So he took over the research after the accident. Not just that, he acquired the ranch in a questionable process. Your mother was fragile, concerned with your recovery. She signed documents without fully understanding the implications. In a few weeks, Thomas was the new owner and began to implement his own modifications to the research. Emily processed that information, trying to connect the dots. But if Thor was so special, why does Thomas keep him hidden? Why not publicize this scientific achievement? Mike came even closer, his voice now almost inaudible. Because your father's method was controversial, the origin of the neural patterns wasn't conventional. And there's something else, something I discovered years after the accident, when I found one of Dr. Robert's research diaries that Thomas couldn't locate. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And hit like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We'll continue. The silence that followed seemed to weigh tons. Emily stared at Mike, waiting for him to continue, while her heart beat so strongly it seemed to want to escape from her chest. What diary? She finally asked, unable to contain her anxiety. What? Did my father write? Mike stood up, going to the window to check if there was anyone nearby. Satisfied with the momentary privacy, he sat back down, leaning forward. Your father was working on something called Project Symbiosis. The idea was to create a neural link between beings of different species, he explained, his voice almost a whisper. In the early stages, he used his own neural patterns as a model, transferring small portions of his brain structure to Thor. That sounds impossible, murmured Emily, although something inside her knew it was true. It seemed impossible to all of us too, agreed Mike. But your father succeeded. Thor began to demonstrate behaviors that reflected some of Robert's mannerisms. The way he tilted his head when observing something curious, the way he seemed to evaluate situations before acting. Emily remembered the way Thor had looked at her in the stable, that disturbing sensation of familiarity. In the diary, continued Mike, your father recorded something disturbing. In the more advanced phases of the experiment, the transfer began to occur in both directions. He started to have dreams that weren't his, visions of open fields, physical sensations that an animal would experience. The barrier between the two consciousnesses was becoming fluid. And the accident? On the day everything happened, your father was planning something extraordinary. He believed he had found a way to transfer consciousness more completely, preserving the individuality of both beings, but allowing direct communication between them. You were present because... Mike hesitated. Because, insisted Emily, because you were part of the experiment. From a young age, you demonstrated a special connection with animals. Your father believed that young minds had greater plasticity, greater capacity for adaptation to new patterns of thought. He wanted you to be the first child to establish a neural connection with Thor. Emily felt as if the floor disappeared beneath her chair. Flashes of memory flooded her mind. Her father adjusting electrodes on her head, talking about making history together, a special helmet that she wore when visiting Thor. But something went wrong, she said, not as a question, but as a statement. Yes, the equipment suffered an overload during the process. There was an explosion followed by a fire in the laboratory. When we managed to get in, your father was— Mike swallowed hard. And you were unconscious, with serious injuries to your spine. The doctors didn't believe you would survive. And Thor? Strangely, Thor seemed normal, calm even, as if he was waiting for something. In the days following the accident, while you were in the hospital, he began to demonstrate unusual behaviors. He refused to eat, kept looking at the ranch entrance as if expecting someone. Emily remained silent, absorbing that revelation. The buffalo not only carried fragments of her father's neural patterns, there was a much deeper connection. The diary, Mike continued, your father wrote about his final theory. He believed that under certain conditions, human consciousness could persist even after the dissolution of its original container, that the essence of someone could find a new home, provided there was a previously prepared compatible structure. Are you suggesting that my father— Emily couldn't complete the sentence. The implication was too absurd, too disturbing. I'm not suggesting anything, miss. Just sharing what your father theorized. What really happened on the day of the accident, only Thor knows. A heavy silence fell over the room. What Mike insinuated was almost impossible to accept, and yet it explained the strange connection she had felt with the buffalo, the recognition in the animal's eyes, the uneasiness that had pursued her since she arrived at the ranch. And Thomas, does he know all this? Suspects at minimum. He's been studying Thor for years, trying to replicate your father's work, but without success. What Robert achieved was unique, a specific combination of factors that Thomas can't reproduce, despite all his money and technology. That's why he's so interested in Thor, and that's why he invited me to visit the ranch. The realization hit Emily like lightning. He knows who I am. He knows about my connection with Thor. Mike nodded slowly. Thomas is an intelligent man, obsessive even. He researched every detail of your father's life, including his family. When you began to gain recognition as a journalist, especially writing about agribusiness, he saw an opportunity, completed Emily, a chance to solve the enigma that has tormented him for years. A noise in the corridor made Mike abruptly stand up. I can't stay any longer, I've said too much. He quickly headed to the door but stopped with his hand on the doorknob. Thor has been restless since your arrival. If what your father theorized is true, even partially, perhaps there's a reason for that. When Mike left, Emily was alone with her swirling thoughts. The story seemed too absurd to be true, and yet it explained so many things. The inexplicable fascination she had always felt for the rural world, despite her urban life, the recurring dreams with landscapes she had never visited, the sensation of incompleteness that had accompanied her since childhood. She looked at the window, where the full moon illuminated the fields of Hope Ranch. Somewhere out there, in an isolated stable, Thor waited. And maybe, just maybe, a part of her father was also waiting. The clock marked almost midnight when Emily made her decision. She wouldn't be able to sleep with so many unanswered questions, with so many disturbing possibilities circulating in her mind. She needed to see Thor again alone, without Thomas's intimidating presence or the curious glances of the employees. Moving silently in a wheelchair wasn't an easy task, but years of adaptation had taught her some tricks. She checked the corridor, empty and dark as expected. The main house of the ranch was silent, only the occasional creaking of the old wood breaking the nighttime quiet. Emily glided down the side ramp that gave access to the garden. The path to Thor's stable would be challenging, especially in the dark, but she was determined. She had noticed a paved path during the afternoon tour, probably used to transport equipment. If she followed it, she could reach the stable without facing the uneven terrain of the fields. The night was surprisingly clear, the full moon providing enough illumination for her to navigate safely. Emily felt a mixture of fear and excitement, like a child about to discover a forbidden secret. And in a way, that's exactly what she was doing, unearthing a secret that had been hidden from her for more than 20 years. As she approached the stable, Emily noticed something strange. There were no guards. During the day, Ryan and at least 2 other employees constantly monitored the place. Now the stable seemed unprotected, almost as if someone had deliberately facilitated her access. The door was unlocked, another disturbing detail. Emily pushed it slowly, hesitantly, her heart beating rapidly against her chest. The interior was partially illuminated by a single security lamp, projecting elongated shadows on the walls. "Thor," she called in a low voice, immediately feeling foolish for speaking to an animal as if it could answer. A movement in the fenced area indicated that the buffalo was awake. Thor raised his head, his nostrils dilating as he caught Emily's scent. He showed no surprise or agitation, only a contemplative calm, as if he had been waiting for her. Emily brought her chair closer to the fence, maintaining a safe distance, but close enough to observe the animal in detail. Thor's eyes, deep and intelligent, fixed on her with a disconcerting intensity. "Did my father really transfer part of his consciousness to you?" she whispered, not really expecting an answer. "Or am I just a journalist with a fertile imagination, desperate to find meaning in the loss of my father?" Thor slightly tilted his head to the side, an almost human gesture that sent shivers down Emily's spine. She remembered old photos of her father, how he tilted his head exactly the same way when intrigued by something. "If you could speak—" Emily left the sentence hanging in the air, suddenly aware of the absurdity of the situation. And yet, there was something in that moment, a connection that transcended logic and reason. Thor moved closer to the fence, his movements slow and deliberate. Nothing like the agitation he had demonstrated during the afternoon incident. When he was close enough, the buffalo lowered his massive head to Emily's eye level. That's when it happened. A flash of memory hit Emily, not one of her own memories, but something completely different. She saw herself in a laboratory, but not from a child's perspective, rather from an adult's. She saw her own hands, no, her father's hands, adjusting complex equipment. She felt the fatigue of sleepless nights, the obsession of years of research, the excitement of being on the verge of a revolutionary discovery. The vision lasted only a second, but it was so vivid, so real, that Emily gasped, instinctively backing away. Thor remained motionless, his eyes still fixed on her. "This is impossible," she murmured, trembling. "I can't be seeing your memories, or his memories." But deep down, she knew that was exactly what was happening. Somehow, the connection that her father had begun to establish years ago still existed, and Thor was trying to communicate with her in the only way he could. "What are you trying to show me?" asked Emily, approaching again, trying to overcome the fear of the unknown. "What happened that day?" Thor moved again, his forehead almost touching the fence that separated them. Emily hesitated for a moment, then extended her hand, letting her fingers hover inches from the buffalo's snout. "Show me," she whispered. The touch was like a short circuit in her brain. Images flooded her mind. The laboratory on the day of the accident, her father adjusting the equipment, herself as a child, sitting in a special chair with an electrode helmet, Thor in a separate chamber, also connected to machines, her father talking about making history, about transcending the barriers between species. Then, chaos, a system failure, alarms sounding, her father running to shut down the equipment, an explosion, pain, darkness, and then something more disturbing, the sensation of being in 2 places at once, of being 2 different creatures simultaneously. Emily pulled back, breaking contact, breathless and disoriented. The images faded, but the sensation persisted. This wasn't just a telepathic connection or some kind of memory transfer. It was as if, for a brief moment, she had experienced what her father and Thor experienced on the day of the accident, the dissolution of the barrier between 2 distinct consciousnesses. "He's in there, isn't he?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Somehow a part of my father survived in you." Thor emitted a low sound, not a typical bellow, but something softer, almost like a human sigh. Emily felt a sudden certainty. She wasn't imagining things. Her father's final theory, as absurd as it seemed, contained a kernel of truth. Consciousness could, in fact, transcend its original form. A noise coming from the stable entrance made Emily quickly turn her chair. There, standing in the shadows, was Thomas Anderson, observing the scene with an expression impossible to decipher. "I see you finally understand," he said calmly, advancing into the light. "It took me years to accept what I witnessed that night. I imagine for you, his daughter, it must be even more difficult." Emily felt a chill down her spine. "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough to confirm what I've always suspected," replied Thomas, slowly approaching. "The connection wasn't just with Robert, it was with you too, wasn't it? On that day, when the accident happened, something was transferred, not just from him to Thor, but to you as well." Emily stared at Thomas, suddenly aware of the vulnerability of her position. They were alone in the stable, in the middle of the night, far from any possible help. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to buy time while assessing her options. Thomas approached, his eyes shining with an almost feverish intensity. "When I bought this ranch, I knew I was acquiring something extraordinary. Robert's experiments were revolutionary, decades ahead of any research in the field. But for years I was missing the final piece of the puzzle." "Thor," said Emily. "Not just Thor," corrected Thomas, "but the complete connection. You see, I managed to replicate part of your father's work. I created animals with enhanced intelligence, capable of understanding complex commands, solving problems that no normal animal could. But I never achieved what Robert accomplished with Thor." "A shared consciousness," murmured Emily, Mike's words echoing in her mind. "Exactly." Thomas seemed genuinely impressed. "For years I observed Thor, studied every aspect of his behavior. He demonstrates patterns that aren't just enhanced intelligence, but fragments of a human consciousness. The looks, the gestures, the way he reacts to certain words or situations. It's as if Robert were there, somehow." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. The confirmation of her suspicions coming from Thomas made everything even more real, more disturbing. "And what does that have to do with me?" she asked, although she already suspected the answer. Thomas took a few more steps, coming so close that Emily had to tilt her head to look at him. "You were in the laboratory that day, connected to the same system as your father and Thor. When the accident happened, something beyond physical damage occurred to you." Emily felt her mouth go dry. "What are you implying?" "Why do you think you developed this obsession with the rural world? Why, even growing up in the city, far from all this, do you gravitate towards stories about agribusiness? Why do you feel this inexplicable connection to places you've never visited?" Thomas was speaking rapidly now, almost without pause to breathe. "Because part of your father's consciousness, or perhaps part of Thor's consciousness, is in you too." The implications of those words were overwhelming. Emily looked at Thor, who was watching the scene with unusual attention, as if he understood every word exchanged between them. "You didn't invite me here for a report," she concluded. "You wanted to confirm your theory. You wanted to see how I would react when meeting Thor." Thomas smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Smart, like your father. Yes, I needed to verify if the connection still existed, if it would manifest after all these years. And when I saw Thor's reaction this afternoon, it was extraordinary. He recognized you instantly." "Why? What do you gain from all this?" "What do I gain?" Thomas seemed genuinely surprised by the question. "Knowledge, Emily, the key to the next stage of human evolution. Imagine the potential, not just animals with enhanced intelligence, but a true symbiosis between species. The ability to transfer consciousness, to preserve it beyond physical existence." There was something hypnotic in the way he spoke, a gleam in his eyes that bordered on insanity. Emily realized she wasn't facing a simple, greedy businessman, but a man consumed by a scientific obsession that transcended immediate profit. "My father died because of these experiments," she said firmly. "And Thor. If what you say is true, he's trapped between two worlds, neither completely buffalo nor completely human. What right do we have to play like this with the nature of consciousness? Thomas laughed, a cold sound that echoed through the stable. Your father would say that's exactly the role of science, expanding boundaries, questioning limits. He didn't hesitate to use you in the experiment, even knowing the risks. The words hit Emily like a punch. It was true. Her father had deliberately put her in that dangerous situation, driven by the same obsession she now saw in Thomas. "What do you intend to do now?" she asked, trying to remain calm. "Complete what Robert started," replied Thomas, his tone suddenly pragmatic. "With you here, we have all the elements of the original experiment. Are you Thor and the equipment I rebuilt based on your father's notes?" Emily felt her blood freeze in her veins. "You're crazy if you think I'll voluntarily participate in some experiment." "Voluntarily would be ideal," agreed Thomas, "but it's not essential. The important thing is that the neural connection already exists. It was established that day more than 20 years ago. My job is just to reactivate it, strengthen the bond that's already there." At that moment, Thor emitted a deep sound, almost a contained roar. The animal seemed agitated, moving restlessly in his fenced space. His eyes, fixed on Thomas, conveyed something close to anger. "It seems not everyone agrees with your methods, Mr. Anderson," observed Emily, gaining confidence at seeing Thor's reaction. Thomas cast a worried look at the buffalo. "Thor has always been unpredictable. It's part of what makes him so special, and I admit, sometimes problematic for my research." "Maybe it's my father protesting against your plans," suggested Emily, surprising herself with her own words. Part of her still didn't completely believe that fantastic story, but another part, the one that had experienced the connection with Thor moments before, knew there was a truth there, however disturbing it might be. Thomas's expression hardened. "Don't test my patience, Emily. I came here to offer a partnership, a chance to voluntarily participate in something revolutionary, but with or without your cooperation, I will move forward. And if I leave tomorrow morning, if I tell the world about your unethical experiments, who would believe you?" Thomas smiled again, confident. "A freelance journalist accusing one of the biggest agribusiness entrepreneurs of conducting consciousness transfer experiments. You'd be ridiculed. Besides..." He left the sentence hanging, its implicit meaning perfectly clear. Emily assessed her situation. She was alone, vulnerable, in hostile territory. Even if she managed to leave the ranch, she had no concrete proof of anything she had discovered. She needed to buy time, find a way to document what was happening, and mainly, fully understand the nature of her connection with Thor. "You're right," she finally said, surprising Thomas. "No one would believe me without proof, but that doesn't mean I agree with your methods or objectives." "I don't expect you to agree, just to cooperate," he replied, visibly relieved by Emily's apparent surrender. "We can start the tests tomorrow. Nothing invasive at first, just measurements of your and Thor's brain activity when you're close." Emily nodded slowly, pretending to consider the proposal. "And if we discover that a connection really exists, what happens next?" "Next, we document, study, expand. Imagine the possibilities, Emily. We could eventually create a way to preserve brilliant minds after physical dissolution, transfer knowledge directly from one being to another." As Thomas rambled about future possibilities, Thor continued to observe them attentively. Emily noticed something in the animal's behavior, a pattern in how he moved, tilting his head, lightly tapping with one of his front hooves. It wasn't random agitation. It seemed almost deliberate. "It's getting late," interrupted Thomas, checking his watch. "We both need to rest for tomorrow. Let's return to the main house." Emily cast one last look at Thor before allowing Thomas to guide her wheelchair out of the stable. The buffalo kept his eyes fixed on her until the last moment, as if trying to communicate something vital, something she hadn't yet fully understood. The night was advancing slowly, but Emily couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, images of the encounter with Thor invaded her mind, fragments of memories that didn't belong to her, sensations that defied logic. She knew she needed to find concrete answers before Thomas initiated his tests the following morning. Mike's mention of her father's diary that Thomas hadn't been able to locate awakened an intriguing possibility. If that diary still existed somewhere on the ranch, it could contain crucial information, perhaps even a way to undo the strange connection between her, Thor, and the remnants of her father's consciousness. Emily slid from the bed to her wheelchair with the skill of someone who has performed the movement for decades. The silence of the house was broken only by the occasional creaking of the old wood and the distant noise of the ranch animals. She slowly opened the door to her room, checking the corridor, empty as expected at that hour of the early morning. "If I were a secret diary," she murmured to herself, "where would I be hidden?" Her instinct told her that the laboratory would be the most likely place, but also the most guarded. Mike had mentioned finding the diary years after the accident, which suggested a less obvious hiding place. Emily tried to access her own childhood memories, looking for some clue about her father's habits. An image emerged in her mind, not a conventional memory, but another of those strange visions that had begun after her contact with Thor. She saw herself walking, yes, walking, which confirmed it was someone else's memory, to a small building annexed to the main house. A private office, a refuge where Robert Carter used to record his thoughts away from the aseptic environment of the laboratory. Emily knew exactly where that place was. During the afternoon tour, Thomas had mentioned in passing a small library that he had preserved out of respect for the former owner's work. At the time, the comment had seemed just a curiosity, but now it assumed a completely new meaning. Navigating the dark corridors of the house required total concentration. Emily avoided the creaking floorboards, moving with the calculated slowness of someone who cannot afford to be discovered. After what seemed like an eternity, she reached the small dark wooden door that gave access to the library. To her surprise, the door wasn't locked. Emily pushed it slowly, mentally thanking the impeccable maintenance that prevented any revealing creaking. The interior was shrouded in penumbra, illuminated only by the moonlight entering through a small window. The library was an intimate space, with floor-to-ceiling shelves covering 3 of the 4 walls. A solid wood desk occupied the center of the room, preserved exactly as her father had left it, even with a pair of reading glasses resting on a stack of notes. Emily felt a tightness in her chest. It was like being in her father's presence again, breathing the same air he had breathed, touching the objects that had once been part of his daily life. But she couldn't let herself be carried away by emotion. Time was precious and limited. Methodically, she began to examine the shelves. Scientific books, specialized journals, genetics encyclopedias. The collection reflected Robert Carter's academic interests. But where would the personal diary that Mike had mentioned be? A new image emerged in her mind, her father removing a specific book from the shelf, revealing a hidden compartment behind it. Emily closed her eyes, trying to capture more details. Which book on which shelf? She felt a strange sense of urgency, as if something was impelling her in the right direction. Her eyes were drawn to a particularly worn volume of Comparative Neural Structures, a book that seemed out of place among more recent works on bovine genetics. With her heart racing, Emily reached for the book and pulled it. Nothing happened. She felt a twinge of disappointment, but something made her examine the volume more carefully. It wasn't an ordinary book. The pages were glued together, forming a solid block, and the spine was abnormally thick. "A box," she whispered, turning, the fake book in her hands, until finding a small hidden mechanism on the bottom. When she pressed it, the cover opened, revealing an internal compartment where rested a leather-bound notebook, visibly aged by time. Emily immediately recognized the elegant and precise handwriting on the first page: Research Diary, Project Symbiosis, Robert Carter. Her hands trembled as she leafed through the pages, absorbing fragments of notes about neural transfer, shared consciousness, and preliminary experiments. The date of the last entry made her heart tighten. It was from the day before the accident. Her father had recorded in detail the procedure he planned to perform, including complex equations and diagrams of the equipment. Emily didn't understand all the technical terms, but she understood enough to be horrified by the magnitude of what her father intended to do. The complete synchronization of the 3 consciousnesses represents the most significant advance in the history of neuroscience, he had written. Emily will serve as a catalyst. Her young and adaptable mind is the perfect equilibrium, point between my adult consciousness and Thor's primordial consciousness. The shock of the revelation left Emily momentarily paralyzed. Her father wasn't just trying to transfer his own consciousness to Thor. She, Emily, was an integral part of the experiment, an essential component of the bridge between human and animal. Continuing to read, she found something even more disturbing. In the event of a catastrophic system failure, I have implemented an emergency protocol. The reversal sequence is encoded in Thor himself, accessible only through the mnemonic key that only Emily knows. Emily frowned. What mnemonic key? She didn't remember any code or password that her father had taught her, unless... A noise in the corridor interrupted her thoughts. Someone was approaching the library. Quickly, Emily tucked the diary into a bag attached to her wheelchair, returned the fake book to the shelf, and positioned herself to appear as if she was just casually browsing the collection. The door opened, revealing Mike's silhouette against the faint light of the corridor. "I thought I might find you here," he said in a low voice, entering and closing the door behind him. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Emily hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "My father's diary? You knew it was here?" "I suspected. Robert was always methodical in his records, and this place was sacred to him." Mike approached, his face marked with concern. "What did you discover?" "That I wasn't just an observer in the experiment. I was an integral part of it. My father was using my mind as a kind of neural bridge between him and Thor." Mike sighed heavily. "Your father loved you, Emily. He would never deliberately put you in danger. He genuinely believed the experiment was safe. And I also discovered that there's a reversal protocol, something encoded in Thor himself, which only I can access through some mnemonic key." She frowned. "But I have no idea what this key is." A glimmer of recognition illuminated Mike's eyes. "The lullaby," he said, his voice little more than a whisper. "Your father sang to you every night before bed, a melody he composed himself. He did the same thing with Thor, visited the stable every night and sang the same song to the animal." Emily felt a wave of emotion invade her. She vaguely remembered the melody, a unique lullaby that her father sang with his deep and soft voice. It was an almost lost memory, buried under trauma and years, but it was still there, somewhere. Dawn was tinting the horizon with shades of pink and gold when Emily and Mike arrived at Thor's stable. The ranch was beginning to wake up, distant sounds of tractors being started and workers' voices echoed across the fields. But this specific area remained strangely silent, as if isolated from the rest of the property. "We have little time," whispered Mike, nervously checking the surroundings. "Thomas usually comes to check on Thor at 6 o'clock before starting his routine." Emily nodded, her heart beating so hard it seemed to echo in the dawn silence. Her father's diary was safe in her bag, its discoveries still reverberating in her mind. Mike had helped her decipher the technical notations, confirming her most disturbing suspicions. Her father's experiment had, in fact, created a triple link between her, Thor, and Robert Carter. "Are you sure about this?" asked Mike, his voice betraying genuine concern. "We don't know exactly what will happen when you try to activate the reversal protocol." "I have no choice," Emily replied firmly. "Thomas won't stop his obsession. If he manages to complete what—" My father started. "No one will be safe. The idea of consciousness transfer in the hands of someone like him." She left the sentence hanging, but both understood the implications. Thomas saw no ethical limits in his pursuit, and the power to preserve or transfer consciousness, even partially, was too dangerous to remain under his control. As they entered the stable, Thor was already awake, as if waiting for them. The buffalo observed Emily with that disconcerting intensity that she now recognized as something beyond animal intelligence. It was recognition, understanding, perhaps even the fragment of her father's consciousness trying to communicate. "I'll—" "Stand guard at the entrance," said Mike, briefly squeezing Emily's shoulder. "Good luck." Alone with Thor, Emily felt the weight of the task ahead of her. She took a deep breath, bringing her chair closer to the fence, nearer than she had ever dared before. "Hello, Thor," she said softly. Or perhaps I should say, Dad? The buffalo tilted his head, his gaze fixed and attentive. Emily felt that strange connection strengthening, not just imagination or desire to find meaning in the inexplicable, but something real, tangible, like an electric current connecting their minds. According to the diary, the reversal protocol was activated by a specific stimulus that functioned as a key, the lullaby that her father had composed especially for her. The simple melody would serve as a trigger to unlock the neurological sequence that could, theoretically, undo the anomalous link between them. Emily closed her eyes, searching in her memory for the notes of the song. For a moment, she was afraid she wouldn't be able to remember. Years had passed, and that memory was buried under layers of trauma and pain. But then, like water emerging from an underground spring, the melody began to flow. Her voice, hesitant at first, gained confidence as the words returned. A soft song about stars that guide the way home, about bonds that not even time can break. It wasn't just an ordinary lullaby, it was an emotional code, loaded with personal meaning between a father and his daughter. Thor remained motionless, his eyes never leaving Emily's face. As the song progressed, something extraordinary began to happen. A sensation of warmth spread through Emily's body, starting at the base of her spine, where the accident had caused irreparable damage, and slowly rising, like a warm wave traveling through her dormant nerves. Images began to emerge in her mind, not disconnected fragments like before, but a coherent narrative. The laboratory on the day of the accident, her father making the final adjustments to the equipment, she sitting in the special chair, Thor in the adjacent chamber. Her father's excitement almost palpable, his conviction that they were about to make history. Then the critical moment, the system overload, alarms sounding, her father running to interrupt the process, to save her, the explosion, the blinding pain. And then darkness. But it wasn't the end of the story. In the darkness, something had remained, consciousness, fragmented but persistent. Her father, struggling to maintain coherence as his mind dispersed between three different receptacles. His own damaged body, the buffalo's mind, and his little daughter's mind. Emily saw through her father's eyes the decision being made in fractions of a second, to direct what remained of his consciousness, to protect his daughter's mind from trauma, to use the buffalo as the main receptacle. A final act of paternal love, sacrificing himself so that she could survive, even if it meant a partial, fragmented existence, divided between forms. Tears flowed freely down Emily's face as the song came to an end. Thor emitted a low sound, not a bellow, but almost a human sigh. And then the buffalo did something extraordinary. He approached the fence and, with surprising delicacy for such a large animal, lowered his head until it was at the level of Emily's eyes. The eye contact was like a circuit being closed. Emily felt a discharge of energy coursing through her body, an intense tingling descending her spine, reaching the legs she hadn't felt for more than 20 years. Breathless, she looked down, incredulous, as her toes moved. Just a slight tremor, but an undeniable movement, impossible, according to all the doctors who had treated her. "Dad," she whispered, finally understanding the total sacrifice that Robert Carter had made. Not only had his physical life been lost in that accident, but his consciousness had remained in a limbo for decades, partially trapped in the buffalo, partially connected to his daughter, keeping alive the neural function that doctors believed forever lost. Thor blinked once, slowly, a deliberate gesture that Emily knew, with absolute certainty, was her father saying goodbye. "What's going on here?" Thomas's sharp voice cut through the sacred moment. He was standing at the entrance to the stable, his face contorted in a mixture of anger and shock at seeing the proximity between Emily and Thor. "I'm finishing what my father started," replied Emily, her voice calm despite her racing heart. "Not in the way you imagine, but in the way he truly desired." "Get away from the buffalo right now," ordered Thomas, advancing threateningly. "You have no idea what you're messing with." "On the contrary," replied Emily, feeling a new strength flowing through her body. I understand perfectly. My father never wanted to create a technology to artificially transfer or preserve consciousness. He discovered that consciousness naturally transcends its physical form, not through machines or invasive procedures, but through genuine connections, through love. Thomas laughed bitterly. Poetry isn't science, Miss Carter. What your father created was a replicable process, a technology that can revolutionize our understanding of the human mind. No. What he discovered was that consciousness cannot be forced into new containers. It flows naturally when there's a true connection. Emily looked at Thor, who remained extraordinarily calm despite the growing tension. My father chose to sacrifice himself for me. Part of him remained with me, keeping alive the hope of recovery that doctors dismissed. And now finally he can rest. As she spoke, Emily felt something incredible happening. Not just the movement in her feet, but a sensation rising through her legs, as if neural circuits dormant for years were awakening. Slowly, supporting herself on the fence, she rose from her chair, her legs trembling with the unprecedented effort. Thomas's face transformed into a mask of astonishment. Impossible! Your injury was irreversible. Science still has much to learn about consciousness and connection, replied Emily, taking a hesitant step, the first in more than 20 years. Some truths transcend our limited research methods. At that moment, Mike appeared behind Thomas, accompanied by Maria, whose expression mixed shock and joy at seeing her friend standing. "It's over, Thomas," said Emily, her voice firm despite her trembling legs. "My father's legacy isn't a technology that you can exploit, but a truth that you never understood. Consciousness transcends form when guided by love, not by ambition." Thor emitted a deep sound, not of agitation or threat, but almost of relief. His eyes, which for so long had carried that disturbingly human look, seemed different now, still intelligent, but purely animal, as if freed from an external presence. Emily felt the change within herself as well. Where before there had been inexplicable gaps in her memory, now there was completeness. Where there had been fragments of desires and interests that didn't seem entirely her own, now there was clarity. The part of her father's consciousness that had remained with her, sustaining her neural connection with her paralyzed legs, could finally dissolve completely, its purpose fulfilled. As the sun fully rose over Hope Ranch, Emily took another step forward, then another, walking slowly toward Maria and the future that awaited her, no longer limited by a wheelchair nor by the shadow of an incomprehensible past. Thor watched tranquilly, now just an extraordinary buffalo, free from the burden of carrying fragments of a human consciousness. And somewhere beyond physical comprehension, Robert Carter finally found peace, his last act of paternal love completed. Consciousness, as he had always believed, had transcended form. Not through technology or scientific manipulation, but through the most fundamental and powerful of human bonds, the love between a father and his daughter. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Tell us what city you're watching from.